For most of my life, I believed I was a lucky man. Not rich, not flashy, just lucky in the quiet, dependable way that matters when you're building a life with someone. The kind of luck that shows up in routine mornings, shared grocery lists, and knowing exactly how the other person takes their coffee without ever having to ask. My wife and I have been married for 38 years. That number meant something to me. It wasn't just time, it was proof. Proof that we'd survived layoffs, illnesses, arguments that lasted days, and stretches where money was so tight we counted coins before filling the gas tank. We'd raised a child together, bought a house we couldn't afford at the time, and slowly turned it into a home. We had history layered so thick it felt permanent. Or at least, that's what I thought. Our life wasn't exciting, but it was steady. I worked long hours. She handled the house. We had our routines down to muscle memory. Sundays were for errands and leftovers. Weeknights were quiet. We didn't go out much anymore, but we didn't miss it either. Comfort replaces excitement when you've been together long enough. People say that's when relationships die. I always thought that was nonsense. To me, comfort meant trust. Every morning, I woke up at the same time. Same alarm. The same groan as my knees reminded me I wasn't 30 anymore. I'd shower, shave, and step into the kitchen where she'd already be moving around, sometimes humming, sometimes just staring out the window while the coffee brewed. We didn't talk much in the mornings. We didn't need to. That silence wasn't awkward. It was earned. It was the kind that comes after decades of knowing someone so well that words feel unnecessary. A glance could say more than a conversation. At least it used to. I handled the bills. She handled the calendar. I fixed things when they broke. She remembered birthdays and appointments. If something went wrong, we dealt with it together. That was the agreement we never spoke out loud but both lived by. Looking back now, I realize how dangerous assumptions can be. Because when you assume loyalty, you stop looking for cracks. And cracks don't announce themselves. They whisper. Our house reflected our life. Orderly, predictable, a little dated. The same couch we bought years ago. The same framed photos lining the hallway. Vacations we barely remembered. Our daughter growing up year by year. Holiday smiles frozen in time. I passed those photos every day. I never once thought they could lie. Friends would tell me I was lucky. That not everyone makes it that long. I nod, agree, feel proud. 38 years felt like a badge I'd earned. Like something solid no one could take away. I didn't realize that longevity doesn't guarantee honesty. It only guarantees time. Our daughter had grown up and moved out years ago. She had her own life, her own problems, her own marriage. We were empty nesters now, and for a while, that had brought us closer, or so I believed. Fewer distractions, more time together. But time together doesn't mean connection. It just means proximity. I never worried about infidelity. Not once. That's not arrogance. It's trust built over decades. I believed cheating was something that happened to other people. Messy people. Reckless people. Not us. We were bored. And bored felt safe. She used to wait for me when I worked late. Sit on the couch with the TV on low, pretending to watch while listening for my car in the driveway. When I came through the door, she'd look up and smile. Ask how my day was. Ask if I'd eaten. Those moments mattered to me more than I realized. Because at some point, they stopped happening. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. At first, I chalked it up to age. Fatigue. Routine settling in. We were both older now. Less energy. Less spark. That's normal, right? That's what I told myself. She started going to bed earlier. Or later. Sometimes she'd already be asleep when I got home. Other times, she'd still be awake, but distant, absorbed in her phone, her attention fractured. I didn't question it. I should have. We'd stopped being intimate a while back. That wasn't new. It hadn't been sudden. It was a slow fade that felt mutual, almost natural. We never fought about it. We just stopped. And I accepted that. I told myself that love evolves. That intimacy changes. That companionship replaces passion. I wore that belief like armor. What I didn't understand was that intimacy doesn't disappear. It just moves. I trusted her completely. That's the part people struggle to understand. They think betrayal requires warning signs, so obvious you must be blind to miss them. They imagine arguments, cold shoulders, suspicious behavior. But betrayal often hides behind normalcy, behind routine, behind trust. Our conversations became shorter, but not hostile. Our evenings are quieter, but not tense. There were no screaming matches, no slam doors, no dramatic shifts that would have forced me to pay attention. Just subtle absences. She laughed less around me, smiled more at her phone, started caring about her appearance in ways she hadn't for years. New clothes, new perfume, small things. I noticed. I just didn't question them, because questioning would have meant admitting the possibility that everything I believed might be wrong. And that's a terrifying thing to face when your entire life is built on one person. I still remember one evening clearly. I came home later than usual, exhausted, shoulders aching, mind numb from work. I expected the house to be quiet. It usually was by then, but the lights were on. Music was playing softly from the kitchen. She was standing there, back to me, cooking. That shouldn't have felt strange, but it did. She looked different somehow. Not physically, something else. Lighter, distracted, almost anticipatory. When she turned around and saw me, there was a split second where her expression didn't match the moment. Then it snapped into place. A smile. "How was your day?" she asked. I told her it was long. She nodded, barely listening. Her attention drifted back to the stove, to her phone lighting up on the counter. I ate in silence. She barely touched her food. That night, lying in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling and felt something I couldn't name. A sense that I was slightly out of step with my own life. Like a man walking through his house in the dark, confident he knows where everything is, until he stubs his toe on something that was never there before. I told myself I was overthinking. Men do that sometimes. We invent problems because silence feels uncomfortable. So I ignored it. I focused on work, on routine, on the comfort of what I believed was solid. I leaned into a habit like it could protect me. But habits don't protect you from lies. They make you vulnerable to them. I wish I could tell you there was a moment when everything felt obviously wrong. A clear warning, a gut punch, something dramatic enough to justify what came next. There wasn't. There was just a growing distance that felt easier to tolerate than confront. And that's how betrayal thrives. In the space between questions not asked. In the silence people mistake peace. If you'd asked me back then whether my wife was cheating, I would have laughed. Genuinely. I would have defended her without hesitation. 38 years earns that kind of confidence. Or so I thought. Because when trust is absolute, it blinds you completely. And I had no idea that the life I believed I was protecting was already slipping through my fingers. I didn't realize it then. But that was the last chapter of my life where ignorance still felt like safety. Everything after this was something else entirely. The first thing that changed wasn't her behavior. It was mine. I started noticing details I would have ignored before. Small things. Harmless things. The kind of things you only register when something inside you is already unsettled, even if you don't want to admit it. At first, I blamed work. Stress has a way of making you suspicious of shadows. When you're tired, everything feels heavier. Every silence sounds louder. Every pause feels longer than it is. So I told myself that was all it was. Stress. She started spending more time on her phone. Not constantly, but deliberately. The screen always angled away from me. Notifications silenced. If I walked into the room, conversations ended mid-scroll. I didn't accuse her of anything. I joked. "You've got a secret admirer?" I asked once, smiling. She laughed too quickly. "Don't be ridiculous." I let it go. That's what people do when they trust someone. They let things go. Her routines shifted, but subtly. She began leaving the house more often, running errands that took longer than they used to, visiting friends whose names I didn't hear as often before, joining activities that conveniently happened during my longer workdays. Nothing suspicious on its own. Together, though, they formed a pattern I refused to look at directly. She started caring about her appearance again. I don't mean casually. I mean intentionally. New clothes appeared in the closet. Not extravagant, just different. More fitted. More thought out. She bought perfume she hadn't worn in years. When I noticed it, she shrugged and said she wanted to feel nice again. I agreed. I told her she looked good. She smiled, but not the way she used to. It didn't reach her eyes. That bothered me more than I expected. Our conversations became transactional. Short exchanges about logistics. Who was picking up what? Who'd be home late? What needed fixing? We stopped talking about feelings. Not that we did much of that before, but even the small emotional check-ins disappeared. How was your day? Turned into you eat yet? Efficient. Functional. Empty. Some nights, she'd sit across the room scrolling, absorbed in whatever lived behind that screen. Other nights, she'd go to bed early without a word. When I joined her later, she'd already be asleep or pretending to be. I noticed the way her body angled away from mine. I noticed the lack of casual touch. No hand on my arm. No leaning against me on the couch. No absent-minded gestures that used to happen without thinking. I told myself it was age. I told myself we were drifting in a normal way. I told myself everything was fine, because the alternative, that she was choosing distance, felt too heavy to carry. There were moments when something almost slipped. A hesitation, a name she didn't finish saying, a smile she tried to suppress when her phone buzzed. Once I asked who she was texting. She answered immediately. Too soon. Just Linda. I didn't know which Linda. I didn't ask. Another time, I came home earlier than expected. Not dramatically early, just an hour. The house was quiet, but there was a tension in the air I couldn't explain, like a room that had just been aired out after something unpleasant. She was startled when she saw me. Not jumped, just startled. Oh, she said, you're home. That shouldn't have mattered, but it did. She asked why I was early. I told her work ended sooner than expected. She nodded, distracted, then disappeared into another room under the excuse of needing to finish something. I stood in the kitchen alone, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, feeling like I'd interrupted something I wasn't meant to see. Still, I said nothing, because silence is easier than confrontation, because questions invite answers you may not be ready to hear. I started replaying moments in my head late at night. Conversations, expressions, timing. I'd lie awake, staring into the dark, telling myself to stop, that I was being paranoid, that people don't throw away decades over nothing. And yet, my gut wouldn't quiet down. It whispered instead, softly, persistently. She stopped asking about my day altogether. That hurt more than I expected. It wasn't about work. It was about interest, about presence, about being seen. I realized that when I talked, she listened politely but without engagement. Her mind elsewhere. Her attention was borrowed. I found myself pausing mid-sentence sometimes, just to see if she noticed. She didn't. That realization landed harder than any argument ever could. I tried to reconnect. Suggested dinner out. A walk. A weekend plan. She agreed, but without enthusiasm. Like someone checking boxes rather than making memories. When we did go out, she spent more time looking at her phone than at me. I remember sitting across from her at a restaurant we'd been to dozens of times. The same booth, the same menu, the same routine, but it felt like I was sitting with a stranger. She smiled at something on her screen and quickly hid it when she realized I was watching. The smile lingered longer than it should have. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't want to hear the lie. And that's the thing people don't talk about. Sometimes you know a lie is coming before it's spoken. And sometimes you choose ignorance because it hurts less than certainty. I started staying later at work, not because I had to, but because home no longer felt like rest. It felt like walking into a room where something fragile was about to break, and you didn't know how to stop it. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did. Maybe she was relieved. There was one moment I still replay in my head. I asked her if everything was okay between us. Just that. Nothing accusatory. Nothing dramatic. She looked at me for a long second before answering. Of course, she said. Why wouldn't it be? Her tone was calm. Measured. Too calm. I nodded and said nothing. Because if everything was okay, I didn't want to be the man who ruined it by doubting. And if it wasn't okay, I wasn't ready to hear why. That night, I lay awake listening to her breathe, wondering when we'd stop feeling like a team and started feeling like roommates with shared history. I wondered if she noticed the distance growing, or if she'd already stepped over it. The truth is, deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what. And not knowing felt safer than finding out. Because once you find out, you can't unsee it. You can't put it back. So I stayed quiet. I watched. I waited. I told myself that if something truly serious was happening, it would reveal itself. That truth has a way of surfacing eventually. I didn't realize how close I already was to it, or how small the thing would be that finally made everything collapse. I thought betrayal would announce itself loudly. Instead, it crept in quietly, disguised as routine, distance, and excuses I was all too willing to believe. And I had no idea that the next thing I'd find wasn't a message, or a confession, or even a person. It was an object, one that shouldn't have existed at all. No confrontation, no explosión, just a single discovery that makes denial impossible. The day everything changed didn't start dramatically. There was no argument, no suspicious phone call, no gut-wrenching realization in the middle of the night. It was an ordinary morning that felt no different from the hundreds that came before it. That's what still unsettles me the most. I woke up earlier than usual, my mind already half-focused on the day ahead. The house was quiet, too quiet. She was still asleep, turned away from me, her breathing slow and even. I lay there for a moment, watching the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of a neighborhood waking up. Nothing felt wrong. Not yet. I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake her, and went about my routine. Bathroom, sink, mirror. The familiar motions of a man who didn't expect his life to change in the next few minutes. I realized I couldn't find my reading glasses. That was all. Something small, inconvenient, forgettable. I usually left them on the nightstand, but they weren't there. I checked the bathroom counter, the kitchen table, even the couch, thinking maybe I'd taken them out the night before without remembering. Nothing. I went back into the bedroom. She was still asleep, the room dim with early morning light filtering through the curtains. I hesitated for a second before opening her dresser drawer. We didn't have strict boundaries about things like that. After nearly 4 decades together, privacy had become casual. I wasn't snooping. At least, that's what I told myself. I slid open the top drawer carefully, scanning through the usual things. Folded fabric, familiar scents, nothing out of place. Then my hand brushed against something that didn't belong. It wasn't hidden deep, but it was tucked just far enough back that it wouldn't be seen at a glance. I pulled it forward and froze. It was a tube, new and used, clean. I didn't need to read the label to know exactly what it was. The air in the room felt heavier all of a sudden, like something had been removed that had been holding everything together. My glasses were forgotten instantly. My heart started beating faster, not racing, just deliberate, loud enough that I was suddenly aware of it. I stared at the tube in my hand, trying to understand what I was looking at. We hadn't been intimate in years. That wasn't an exaggeration. It wasn't a dry spell. It wasn't a rough patch. It was a quiet, mutual understanding that physical intimacy had faded from our relationship. No resentment, no acquiescence, just acceptance. So why was this here? And why was it hidden? I stood there longer than I realized, my fingers gripping the plastic tighter than necessary. My mind raced through explanations, grasping for anything that would make this harmless. Anything that wouldn't require me to rethink everything. Maybe she bought it a long time ago. Maybe it was something she forgot about. Maybe it wasn't even hers. The excuses came quickly. Too quickly. Because deep down, I already knew. I glanced over my shoulder toward the bed. She hadn't moved. Still asleep. Still peaceful. The woman I thought I knew better than anyone else in the world. For a brief, cowardly moment, I considered putting it back and pretending I'd never seen it. Just closing the drawer and walking away. But once you see something like that, pretending becomes impossible. I examined the tube more closely. It wasn't old. It wasn't dusty. The seal was intact. The packaging is pristine. Recently. Intentional. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not anger. Not yet. Disbelief. This wasn't the kind of discovery you imagine when you think about betrayal. There was no undeniable proof, no smoking gun. Just an object that shouldn't exist in the life we were living. And yet it said everything. I slowly placed it back exactly where I found it. Every movement felt deliberate, careful, like I was handling something fragile that might explode if I wasn't gentle enough. I didn't want anything to look disturbed. I didn't want her to know I'd been there. I closed the drawer softly. My reflection in the mirror looked unfamiliar. Pale, tight around the eyes, older somehow. I left the bedroom without another glance. The coffee tasted bitter that morning. I barely noticed. My mind replayed the moment over and over, searching for an angle where it meant something else, where it didn't change the shape of my life. But the longer I sat with it, the clearer it became. People don't hide things they don't feel guilty about. I watched her wake up. I watched her stretch, yawn, smile sleepily like nothing in the world was wrong. She greeted me the same way she always did. Casual, familiar, normal. And that almost broke me, because now I knew that normal could lie. Every word she spoke felt heavier. Every casual movement felt rehearsed. I wonder how long she'd been carrying this secret. How many mornings like this we'd shared while I remained oblivious. I didn't mention the glasses. I didn't mention the drawer. I didn't mention the tube. I kissed her goodbye and went to work like everything was fine. That might have been the hardest part. Spending the day surrounded by people, answering questions, making decisions, pretending I was the same man I'd been the day before, when I knew something fundamental had shifted. I couldn't concentrate. The image of that drawer kept replaying in my mind. The way it had been placed just out of sight. The way it didn't belong. The way it quietly accused without making a sound. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. Not physically, but emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that comes from holding something in for too long. She was in a good mood that evening. Talkative. Almost cheerful. She cooked dinner, asked about my day, laughed at something on television. I watched her closely. Every smile felt like a test. Every glance felt loaded. Was she always this animated? Or was I only noticing now because I was looking through a different lens? I wondered if she could tell something was wrong. If she sensed a shift. If she was worried I'd found out. But she seemed comfortable. Too comfortable. That night, when she went to bed before me, I stayed up alone in the living room, the house quiet around me. I stared at the hallway leading to the bedroom, my mind racing with questions I wasn't ready to ask. Who? How long? Why? The tube didn't answer those questions. It just made them unavoidable. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind returned to that drawer, to the realization that there was a part of her life I knew nothing about, a part she'd intentionally hidden. And for the first time in decades, I felt like an outsider in my own marriage. The next few days passed in a strange fog. I paid attention in a way I never had before. Not obsessively, quietly. Watching patterns, timing, expressions. The things I dismissed as coincidence now felt like pieces of something larger. She guarded her phone more carefully. She stepped outside to take calls. She mentioned plans that didn't quite add up. And every time I thought about that drawer, about how small the discovery had been, and how massive its implications were, I realized something important during those days. Finding the tube didn't make me angry. It made me alert. Anger would have driven me to confront her immediately, to demand answers, to blow everything up before I understood what I was standing in. But alertness did something else. It made me quiet. It made me patient. I didn't know yet who she was involved with. I didn't know how far it went. I didn't even know if what I feared was true. But I knew this much. Something was happening behind my back. And the woman I trusted with my entire life had chosen secrecy over honesty. That realization didn't come with shouting or tears. It came with a calm resolve I didn't expect. I decided then that I wouldn't confront her. Not yet. Because confronting her would end the story before I understood it. And I needed to understand it. I needed to know the truth. Not the version she'd offer under pressure, but the one revealed through patterns, behavior, and time. So I waited. I watched. And I let her believe her secret was still safe. What I didn't know yet was that the truth I was uncovering wasn't just about an affair. It was about betrayal on a level I never imagined. And the next thing I would discover wouldn't be hidden in a drawer. It would be standing right in front of me. Once you realize something is wrong, you don't see the world the same way anymore. It's like a filter drops away. Things that used to feel random start lining up. Coincidences turn into patterns. You stop listening to what people say and start watching what they do. That's what I did. I didn't accuse her. I didn't question her. I didn't change my routine in any obvious way. On the outside, I was the same man I'd always been, predictable, busy, distracted by work. On the inside, I was alert in a way I'd never been before. I paid attention to timing first. She left the house at the same hours on the same days. Errands that once varied now followed a rhythm. Too consistent to be accidental. Too casual to look suspicious if you weren't looking for it. I started noticing how often those errands lined up with my longer workdays. Not every time, just often enough. She mentioned needing to run out for a bit, or help a friend, or pick something up without details. Not lies exactly, just vague enough to avoid follow-up questions. I stopped asking. That was important. Questions change behavior. Silence reveals it. I watched how she moved through the house when she thought I wasn't paying attention. The way she checked her phone before leaving a room. The way she smiled at messages she never shared. The way she deleted notifications almost as soon as they appeared. Once I caught a glimpse of a name on her screen. It wasn't one I recognized. She tilted the phone away immediately. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. I started coming home at slightly different times, not early enough to raise suspicion, just enough to observe. Sometimes I'd sit in my car for a few minutes before going inside, watching the house from the street. Lights on, lights off, movement behind curtains. Ordinary things. But now they felt loaded. One afternoon, I came home earlier than planned and found the house empty. That wasn't unusual on its own. But her car was gone too, and she hadn't mentioned going out. I checked the clock, checked my phone. No message, no note. I stood in the kitchen, the silence thick, and felt something settle in my chest. Don't panic. Not fear. Confirmation. I sat down and waited. She came home an hour later, carrying grocery bags that looked suspiciously light for the time she'd been gone. When she saw me, she paused, just for a fraction of a second. Then she smiled. "Oh, you're home already?" I nodded. Finished early. She launched into a story about the store being crowded, about running into someone she hadn't seen in years. Details delivered smoothly, almost rehearsed. I listened, and for the first time, I didn't believe a word of it. Her stories started sounding like that more often, over-explained in places that didn't matter, vague where details should have been natural. Lies aren't always clumsy. Sometimes they're too polished. I noticed changes in her energy, too. She seemed lighter on certain days, distracted by others. Some evenings she came home flushed, animated, almost glowing. Other nights, she was distant, irritable, withdrawn. Those moods weren't random. They followed a pattern tied to someone else's presence in her life. I still didn't know who that someone was, but I could feel them between us. I started mapping it out mentally. Days, times, excuses. I didn't write anything down. I didn't need to. The repetition burned it into my memory. She thought she was being careful. She wasn't. Carelessness grows out of comfort, and she was comfortable. One night, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The name lit up the screen. Derek. My stomach dropped. The name meant nothing at first. Just a name. Common enough. Could have been anyone. A co-worker. A friend. A distant acquaintance. But my gut didn't treat it like anything. I stepped away before the screen went dark, my heart beating harder now. Not racing, steady. Focused. Derek. I ran through my mental list. Friends. Family. Neighbors. Co-workers. Then it clicked. Derek. The man who'd been around more often lately. Too often. The one who always seemed to show up when I wasn't home. The one who smiled a little too easily. Lingered a little too long. The one I never thought twice about. Because why would I? He was safe. Or so I thought. I paid closer attention after that. Every interaction replayed itself in my mind with new clarity. The way he laughed with her. The familiarity. The glances that lasted a second too long. The ease between them went beyond politeness. It was all there. I just hadn't wanted to see it. I didn't confront either of them. Not him. Not her. Because now I understood something important. If I confronted her, she'd deny it. Or admit only what she thought I knew. She'd minimize. Deflect. Cry. Apologize. And I'd never know the full truth. I needed more than suspicion. I needed confirmation. So I kept watching. I watched how she dressed on certain days. How she chose outfits with more care when she said she was just running errands. How she checked herself in the mirror before leaving. I watched how Derek's visits followed a rhythm too. Always casual, always justified, always when I wasn't supposed to be around. Until one day I was. I came home unexpectedly again, this time truly early. No warning, no message. I parked down the street and walked quietly the rest of the way. Derek's truck was there, parked like it belonged. My chest tightened. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, feeling something cold and heavy settle into place. Not a shock, not rage, recognition. I didn't rush inside. I waited. I listened. Laughter drifted through the house. Hers. Lighter than it had been with me in months. Warmer. Younger somehow. I stepped inside quietly. They were in the kitchen. Close. Too close. When they saw me, they both reacted at the same time. A quick separation. A shared glance. A beat of silence before explanations rushed in. Derek smiled. Hey, just checking on something for your wife. She laughed nervously. He was just leaving. They sounded convincing. If I hadn't already known, I might have believed them. But I saw the way they looked at each other when they thought I wasn't paying attention. The way relief flashed across their faces when I didn't question them. Derek left quickly. She overcompensated afterward. Extra attentive. Extra sweet. Like someone trying to smooth over a wrinkle they hoped I hadn't noticed. That night, I lay awake replaying everything. The name. The truck. The laughter. The lies. There was no room for denial anymore. The affair wasn't a possibility. It was a fact. And something else became clear too. They thought they were careful. They thought I was oblivious. They thought I was predictable. And that made them careless. That was their mistake. Because the moment you stop being the person people expect you to be, you gain an advantage they don't see coming. I didn't hate them. Not yet. What I felt was something quieter and far more dangerous. Clarity. I knew now that whatever was happening wasn't impulsive. It was planned, repeated, comfortable. And that minute ran deeper than attraction. It meant intent. I didn't know yet how far that intent went. But I was about to find out. Because once you start watching without being seen, people reveal more than they ever intend to. And the next thing I would overhear would change the stakes entirely. There's a difference between knowing you're being betrayed and realizing you're being used. I learned that difference on a quiet evening I almost didn't come home for. Work ran late that day. Inventory issues, staff shortages, the usual mess that keeps you longer than planned. I called to let her know I'd be home late. She sounded relieved, though she tried to hide it. Take your time, she said. I'll just heat up leftovers. That relief stayed with me the whole drive home. I didn't go straight back. Instead, I parked a few houses down and sat in the car, engine off, the street quiet except for the hum of distant traffic. I don't know why I did it. Instinct, maybe, or something inside me that had learned not to trust explanations anymore. The house lights were on. So was his truck. I waited. Minutes passed. Then more. I watched shadows move across windows. I watched the front door stay closed. I watched a life I thought was mine continue without me. At some point, I got out of the car and walked back quietly, sticking to the side of the house like I didn't belong there. The back door was unlocked. She'd never worried about locking it before. I stepped inside and froze. Voices drifted from the living room. Her voice first. Low. Intimate. Not the polite tone she used with neighbors or acquaintances. This was familiar. Soft. Then his. Equally low. Equally comfortable. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stood just out of sight, my back against the wall, the air around me thick with the weight of what I was about to hear. They were laughing. Not nervous laughter. Not guilty laughter. Easy laughter. The kind that comes from people who feel safe. Did you call them? He asked. Yes, she said. I made sure. A pause. And they confirmed everything. My heart thudded once hard. Good, he replied. We just need to be patient. Patient. That word didn't belong in a conversation about an affair. I leaned closer, my pulse pounding in my ears. I hate waiting, she said. But I know you're right. Right about what? You've waited this long, he said. A little longer won't matter. I felt something cold slide down my spine. This wasn't flirtation. This wasn't passion. This was planned. What about him, she asked. There it was. Me. He won't notice, Derek said. You set yourself. He trusts you completely. She laughed softly. That laugh did something to me. Not anger. Not pain. It hollowed me out. He barely pays attention anymore, she said. Half the time I don't think he even sees me. I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek. So it's perfect, Derek replied. By the time anything happens, it'll look natural. Natural. I felt dizzy. Are you sure? She asked. And for a split second, I thought I heard hesitation. But it didn't last. Absolutely, he said. We've been careful, and everything's in place. My chest tightened. Everything. In place. What about the policy? She asked. The word hit me like a punch. Policy. I checked, Derek said. You're the sole beneficiary. The room seemed to tilt. I had to brace myself against the wall. She exhaled slowly. That still feels strange to say out loud. It won't when the money clears, he replied. Then we can finally stop pretending. Pretending. That was what my life had become to them. A role. A delay. A problem waiting to solve itself. What about people asking questions? She said. The neighbors. Our daughter. They won't, Derek said calmly. You grieve. You take time. You sell the house eventually. No one suspects anything. These things happen. These things happen. As if my death were a scheduling inconvenience. My thoughts raced, but my body felt heavy, locked in place by the sheer unreality of what I was hearing. They weren't just betraying me. They were discussing my absence like it was inevitable. Planned. Budgeted. I just don't want anything to go wrong, she said. Nothing will, he replied. You're doing everything right. Everything is right. I realized then that the woman speaking wasn't confused or coerced. She was committed. This wasn't manipulation. It was a partnership. They were equals in this. The laughter returned. Quiet, intimate, conspiratorial. I felt sick. I stepped back slowly, carefully, making sure not to make a sound. Every instinct screamed at me to burst in, to demand answers, to tear the illusion apart. But something else held me back. Clarity. I understood something crucial at that moment. If I confronted them now, I would become a complication. They would lie. They would shift plans. They would cover tracks. And whatever they were planning would continue, just better hidden. I left the house the same way I came in. Quietly, carefully, like a ghost. I sat in my car afterward, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead as the weight of what I'd learned settled in. This wasn't about loneliness. This wasn't about desire. This was about removal. I was an obstacle to the life they wanted. And obstacles, in their minds, weren't meant to be negotiated with. They were meant to be removed cleanly. I didn't drive home right away. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to think. For years, I believed betrayal was emotional, personal, something fueled by dissatisfaction or weakness. What I just heard was none of that. It was cold, measured, deliberate, and that terrified me more than any affair ever could. Because emotions fade. Plans don't. When I finally went back inside later that night, they were sitting apart, the distance carefully restored. Derek left not long after, offering casual goodbyes like nothing unusual had happened. She came to bed later, slipped under the covers beside me, and turned away without a word. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every word I'd heard. Policy, beneficiary, natural, everything in place. I thought about all the moments I'd trusted her without question, all the times I'd handed over control without hesitation. I thought about how easy it had been for them to plan my life without me. And I felt something shift. Fear didn't take over. Anger didn't either. What took its place was resolved. I knew then that I couldn't confront her. I couldn't argue my way out of this. I couldn't appeal to conscience or history or love. Those things no longer mattered to her. What mattered was the outcome. And if outcome was the language she understood, then outcome was the language I would use too. I didn't sleep at all that night. Not because I was afraid of dying in my sleep, but because I was thinking about timing, thinking about mistakes, thinking about how people get careless when they believe they're in control. They thought I was invisible. They thought I was slow. They thought I was predictable. And that was their greatest weakness. Because the moment someone stops seeing you as a threat, they stop protecting themselves. I realized something else too. If they were willing to plan this with such ease, then this wasn't the first time Derek had done something like this. People don't start at murder. They escalate, which meant there were probably other lies, other victims, other stories I didn't know yet. And if I was going to protect myself, I needed to understand him better. Not confront him, study him. Because this wasn't just about surviving. It was about ending something dangerous before it could go any further. By morning, I had made my decision. I would stay quiet. I would stay observant. And I would let them believe their plan was progressing exactly as intended. Because when people believe they're winning, they stop watching their backs. And I was done being the man who wasn't watching. Once you hear people discuss your life like a line item, you stop thinking emotionally. Emotion is a luxury you can't afford when you realize you're dealing with someone who plans instead of feels. I didn't confront Derek. I didn't glare at him. Didn't change my tone. Didn't warn him. I watched him carefully. Because men like him don't slip once. They slip everywhere. You just have to know where to look. The first thing I noticed was how comfortable he was around women like my wife. Not flirtatious in the obvious way. Not clumsy. Not overeager. He listened. He agreed. He mirrored. That's what manipulators do. They don't dominate conversations. They shape them. They let the other person feel understood, valued, special. I started replaying every interaction I'd ever had with him. The compliments he'd given her that sounded harmless at the time. The way he praised her patience, her strength, her sacrifice. Things I'd stopped saying because I assumed she already knew them. He filled a vacuum I didn't realize existed. And he did it methodically. I began noticing how often he showed up when I wasn't around. How natural his excuses sounded. How easily he blended into our life without ever raising suspicion. He didn't force his way in. He was invited. By her. And by my own trust. I paid attention to how he spoke to other women too. Neighbors. Friends. Cashiers at the store. Always polite. Always attentive. Always just a little too interested. It wasn't an attraction. It was an assessment. He was reading people. Testing boundaries. Seeing who responded to warmth and who recoiled from it. That's when it clicked. Men like Derek don't stumble into affairs. They curate them. And men like Derek don't plan one future. They plan options. I started noticing overlaps. Stories he'd told that didn't quite line up. Timelines that shifted slightly depending on who he was talking to. Details that were conveniently vague. Nothing you could call a lie outright. Just flexible truth. That's when I stopped thinking of him as the other man and started thinking of him as something else entirely. A predator. Predators don't look like villains. They look helpful, charming, dependable. They insert themselves slowly, make themselves useful, necessary, trusted. Then they exploit what they've learned. I thought about how quickly he'd discuss my life insurance like it was public knowledge. How confident he'd been. How I practiced. That confidence doesn't come from first attempts. It comes from repetition, from success, which meant I wasn't special. I was just next. That realization was strangely calming. It removed the sting of personal betrayal and replaced it with clarity. This wasn't about love. This was about opportunity. I started paying attention to his schedule. How often he was busy. How often he had flexible time. How often his stories involved helping people. Helping. That word showed up a lot. I also noticed how careful he was never to appear greedy. He never talked about money directly. He talked about stress, about pressure, about being overwhelmed. He let other people offer help. That's manipulation at its cleanest. You don't ask. You let them suggest. I thought about my wife then, not with anger, but with understanding. She wasn't some mastermind. She was vulnerable, lonely, unseen, and he'd found that weakness and wrapped it in validation. That didn't excuse her, but explained to her, and it confirmed something else. If Derek had targeted her this effectively, there are almost certainly others. That's when I started quietly asking questions. Not directly, not suspiciously. Casual comments to neighbors. Observations shared lightly. Names dropped without emphasis. I watched reactions, and I saw it. Confusion, hesitation, recognition. One woman mentioned Derek had helped her with paperwork once. Another said he'd been very supportive during a hard time. Another laughed and said, "He's such a good listener." Different words. Same story. I didn't push. I didn't accuse. I just listened. And what I heard confirmed everything. He moved through people's lives the same way he'd moved through mine. Quietly, comfortably, unnoticed. Until it was too late. I realized then that confronting him would be pointless. Predators thrive on confrontation. They pivot, deny, rewrite narratives. Exposure, though, exposure ends them. But exposure has to be undeniable, public, inescapable, and irreversible. I started thinking less about what he'd done and more about how he operated. He relied on secrecy, in disbelief, on people assuming that couldn't be true. He relied on reputation, on the benefit of the doubt, on silence, which meant the moment he lost control of the narrative, everything would collapse. I didn't need to outsmart him. I just needed to let him believe he was still winning. That's when people like him make mistakes. I thought back to the conversation I'd overheard. How relaxed they were. How certain. How far ahead they thought they were. They weren't hiding anymore. They were celebrating. And celebration breeds carelessness. I realized something else too. If I acted out of anger, I'd lose. If I acted out of fear, I'd lose. But if I acted out of patience, I'd regain control completely. That night, lying beside my wife as she slept, I didn't feel rage. I felt distance, like I was already stepping away from a version of my life that no longer existed. I wasn't her husband anymore. I was an observer, and observers see everything. By morning, I wasn't asking if Derek would expose himself. I was asking when, and more importantly, how public I wanted it to be. People assume that when you uncover a betrayal, confrontation is inevitable. They imagine shouting, demands, tears, explanations ripped out in the open like bandages pulled too fast. They believe truth only counts if it's spoken aloud. I learned something different. Truth doesn't need permission to exist. It just needs time. After everything I'd seen and heard, confronting her would have been the easiest thing in the world. One sentence would have done it. One look, one question she couldn't dodge. But I didn't say anything. Not because I was afraid. Because I understood what confrontation would actually give me. Nothing. She'd cry. She'd deny parts of it. Admit others. Minimize. Blame distance. Blame loneliness. Blame me. She'd say it didn't mean anything. That it wasn't what I thought. And even if she admitted the affair, the deeper truth, the planning, the calculation, would disappear behind apologies and outrage. Derek would deny everything. Men like him always do. He'd paint me as paranoid, unstable, jealous. He'd suggest misunderstandings, coincidences. He'd rewrite the story before I finished telling it. Confrontation would hand them control, and I was done giving them that. So I did the opposite. I stayed exactly the same. I woke up at the same time, went to work as usual, paid the bills, answered questions, smiled when appropriate. On the surface, nothing changed. But internally, I was already gone. I wasn't living my life anymore. I was watching it. That distance gave me clarity I'd never had before. I saw how careless they'd become, how comfortable, how certain they were that I was irrelevant, that I wouldn't notice, that even if I did, I wouldn't act. They underestimated silence. Silence makes people reckless. I paid attention to what they didn't hide anymore. The way Derek no longer seemed nervous when I was around. The way my wife didn't bother masking her mood shifts. They thought the danger had passed. They thought I was neutralized by habit. They were wrong. I started thinking about leverage. Not revenge. Leverage. Revenge is emotional. Sloppy. Short-lived. Leverage is calm. Pelmano. I asked myself what Derek relied on most. It wasn't strength. It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't even a charm. It was invisible. He relied on being unseen, unquestioned, unchallenged. He relied on the assumption that nothing this ugly could be happening in plain sight. And my wife relied on routine, on the idea that nothing would disrupt the life she'd already mentally moved on from. They both relied on my predictability. That's when I realized the most important thing. I didn't need to expose them immediately. I needed to let them expose themselves. Because people reveal the truth fastest when they believe no one is watching. I thought about timing, about patience, about how predators operate when they think the path is clear. They escalate. They get bolder. They stop checking over their shoulder. And when they do, mistakes follow. I knew confrontation would force them into defense mode. But silence? Silence would let them keep moving forward, exactly where I needed them. I also understood something else. If I confronted her, I'd never know how far this went. I'd never know what else Derek was doing, who else he'd targeted, What patterns existed beyond me? And at that point, this wasn't just about my marriage. This was about something larger, something dangerous. I started thinking less like a husband and more like a witness. Witnesses don't interfere. They observe. They collect. They wait. There were nights I lay awake beside her, listening to her breathe, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Not peace, distance. Like I was already on the other side of something irreversible. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned itself out. What replaced it was focus. And focus is far more powerful. I reminded myself constantly, say nothing. Change nothing. That was the hardest part, because every instinct screamed to act, to disrupt, to demand. But instincts are short-sighted. Plans aren't. I thought about what would hurt them the most, not physically, not emotionally, but structurally. What would dismantle the illusion they were building? What would make denial impossible? What would ensure there was no version of events they could control afterward? The answer wasn't confrontation. It was exposure. Public, undeniable, irreversible. But exposure requires timing, and timing requires patience. So I waited. I watched. I let them believe their future was secure. I let them believe their plans were unfolding perfectly. I let them feel safe, because safety makes people sloppy, and sloppiness reveals everything. By the time I finally made a decision, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. I knew exactly what I wasn't going to do. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to accuse. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to plead for honesty. Those options belonged to the man I used to be. The man who trusted without question. The man who believed loyalty was guaranteed by time. I wasn't that man anymore. I had become someone else. Someone patient. Someone observant. Someone who understood that the most devastating consequences don't come from rage. They come from restraint. And once I understood that, everything else fell into place. The only thing left was waiting for the right moment. Because when it arrived, it wouldn't require explanation. The truth would speak for itself. And when it did, there would be no undoing it. There's a moment in every long fall when you stop flailing. Not because you've accepted the ground, but because you finally understand there's no way back to where you started. That's where I was. I didn't wake up that morning thinking, today is the day. There were no dramatic speeches in my head. No trembling hands. Just calm. The kind of calm that comes after weeks of watching, listening, waiting, and realizing that the story has already chosen its ending. They were comfortable now. That was the most dangerous part. Comfort makes people predictable. My wife moved through the house like someone who believed she was in control of her future. She planned ahead. She laughed more. She stopped hiding the small things, assuming the big ones were invisible. Derek followed the same rhythm. He didn't rush anymore. Didn't sneak. Didn't act cautious. He showed up when he wanted, stayed as long as he pleased, and left without looking over his shoulder. They weren't just betraying me anymore. They were rehearsing a life without me. And that meant something important. They weren't watching me. That's when I knew the moment was close. The opportunity didn't announce itself. It never does. It appeared quietly, the way these things always do, wrapped in routine, disguised as nothing. An open house. An empty room. A small window of time no one thought mattered. I remember standing there, the air around me unnaturally still, aware of every sound in the house. The hum of electricity. The distant noise of traffic. My own breathing, slow and steady. This wasn't anger. Anger shakes your hands. This was certainty. I thought about turning away. Not because I doubted what I was doing, but because I understood exactly what it meant. Once this happened, there would be no explanations. No clarifications. No way to soften what came next. This wasn't a confrontation. This was exposure. And exposure doesn't negotiate. I moved carefully, not because I was afraid of being caught, but because precision matters when consequences are permanent. I didn't rush. Rushing is how people make mistakes. Instead, I treated the moment with the same patience I'd treated everything else. I checked my surroundings, listened, waited. Every step felt deliberate. Every second felt heavier than the last. Not because I felt guilty, but because I understood that restraint was about to give way to action. There's a myth that moments like this are charged with adrenaline. They aren't. They're quiet. so quiet that your thoughts become painfully clear. I thought about all the years I trusted without question, all the assumptions I'd built my life on, all the silence I'd mistaken for peace. And I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't revenge. This was inevitable. I wasn't doing anything to them. I was stepping aside and letting the truth move forward on its own. That distinction mattered to me because I knew, deep down, that the consequences they were about to face weren't created by my hand. They were created by their confidence, their arrogance, their belief that no one was paying attention. The moment passed faster than I expected, not because I rushed, but because once you decide something is unavoidable, hesitation disappears. When I stepped away, nothing looked different. That's what struck me most. The house was the same. The air felt the same. The world hadn't reacted at all. And yet, everything had changed. I stood there for a long moment afterward, listening to the silence, letting it settle into me. This was the point of no return. Not because of what I'd done, but because of what I now knew would happen. They would walk forward confidently, unaware that the path beneath them had already collapsed. They would trust routine. They would trust habits. They would trust the same carelessness that had carried them this far. And I would say nothing. I would do nothing. I would simply let time finish what they had started. The waiting afterward was harder than the act itself. Waiting always is. Time stretches when you know something is coming and there's nothing left to decide. I went about my day normally. Answered messages. Made calls. Responding to questions. I laughed at the right moments. I nodded when expected. No one noticed anything different. That anonymity felt strange. Like standing in the eye of a storm that hadn't formed yet. When I came home later, my wife was already preparing for the evening. Music playing softly. Her movements unhurried. Comfortable. She didn't look at me the way she used to. She looked through me, as if I were already gone. That didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It felt final. Derek arrived later, right on schedule. This was inevitable. I wasn't doing anything. No question, no secrecy, just confidence. I watched them interact from a distance, every movement confirming what I already knew. They believed they were untouchable. They believed the hardest part was behind them. They believed the future was already secured. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. My part was finished. As I left, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Not because I was happy, but because uncertainty was gone. Whatever happened next would happen without my involvement. The truth had been set in motion. And the truth doesn't need help. It only needs time. I sat in my car afterward, watching the house, watching the lights, listening to the muted sounds of a life unfolding without me. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt distant, like a man watching a play after realizing he's no longer part of the cast. The waiting stretched on. Minutes felt longer. Silence felt heavier. And then, finally, something changed. Not inside me. Inside the house. A sound. Not loud at first. Confused. Uncertain. Then louder. Sharper. Panic entering the room like a physical presence. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumph. I felt confirmation. Because the moment I've been waiting for wasn't about pain or humiliation. It was about truth breaking through illusion. And once illusion shatters, it does so violently. I knew what was coming next. Not in detail, but in consequence. There would be noise. There would be confusion. There would be witnesses. And there would be no version of events they could control anymore. I stayed where I was, watching, waiting, letting the world do what it always does when lies collapse under their own weight. Because from this point on, there was no hiding. No rewriting. No explanation. Only fallout. The first sound wasn't screaming. It was confusing. A sharp, startled voice cutting through the quiet of the house. Unsteady, disbelieving. The kind of sound someone makes when reality stops behaving the way it's supposed to. I stayed where I was. The second sound was panic. Not loud yet, just urgent. Words overlapping. Movements that didn't make sense. Furniture shifting. A chair scraping across the floor. That was when I knew the illusion had cracked. Panic has a way of accelerating everything. It pulls the future forward faster than anyone expects. I watched from a distance as lights flicked on and off inside the house. Shadows darted across windows. The calm, Rehearsed life they'd been living evaporated in seconds. Their voices rose. Confusion turned to fear. Fear turned to desperation. And desperation makes people loud. That's when the shouting started. Not words anyone could understand, just fragments. Disbelief. Accusations. The kind of frantic talking people do when they realize something irreversible has happened and they don't yet know how bad it is. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt it was inevitable. This was the moment they'd been building toward without knowing it. The moment where secrecy fails. Noise draws attention. Always. A porch light flicked on next door. Then another. Curtains shifted. Someone stepped outside, phone already in hand, scanning the street with concern. The house was no longer private. It was becoming a scene. Inside, the panic intensified. Voices overlapped now, louder, sharper. I heard something hit the floor. Then a sudden, breathless scream, raw, unfiltered fear tearing through the walls. That scream did what panic alone couldn't. It summoned witnesses. A neighbor shouted from across the street. Someone else asked if everything was okay. Another voice called out that they were calling emergency services. I didn't move. I didn't intervene. This wasn't my moment to speak. This was the truth finding its audience. Sirens appeared faster than I expected. Maybe someone nearby had already called. Maybe more than one person had. Red and blue lights spilled across the street, painting the quiet neighborhood in urgency and confusion. Doors opened. People gathered. Phones came out. The house, the one I'd lived in for decades, was suddenly surrounded by strangers. And inside it, the lie had nowhere left to hide. Emergency responders moved quickly. Professional, efficient, uninterested in explanations, only outcomes. They knocked, then pounded, then forced entry when no clear response came back. The door gave way with a sound that echoed louder than the sirens. I watched uniformed figures disappear inside. Shouting followed. Orders. Questions. Confusion thick enough to feel. I could tell from the way voices changed that something was wrong in a way they hadn't anticipated. Not a fire. Not an injury that fits neatly into a report. Something else. Something awkward. Something impossible to ignore. I stepped closer then, not to intervene, but to be seen. To take my place among the witnesses. Neighbors turned when they saw me. Recognition flashed across faces. Sympathy. Confusion. Concern. Is everything okay? Someone asked. I shook my head slowly. I don't know. I just got here. That was true enough. Inside, the volume dropped suddenly. Not because things had calmed down, but because the reality of the situation had landed. Silence, in moments like that, is worse than screaming. It means people are processing something they can't explain away. The responders reappeared moments later, their expressions strained. Not alarmed, not panicked, but unsettled. That's when I knew. Whatever they'd found inside wasn't something they saw every day. A stretcher appeared, then another. The crowd leaned forward instinctively, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that pulls people toward accidents on the highway. I stood still. I didn't need to look. I already knew what the truth looked like when stripped of secrecy. When they came out, the street went quiet. Not silent. Quiet in the way crowds do when something crosses from gossip into shock. No one spoke. No one laughed. No one filmed openly anymore. Because what they were seeing didn't match any version of normal. Two people exposed not just physically, but morally. Faces flushed. Eyes wide with a mixture of pain, humiliation, and a dawning realization that there was no explanation that could undo this. They didn't look at each other. They didn't look at anyone. They stared at the sky, the ground, anywhere but the faces surrounding them. That's when recognition rippled through the crowd. Whispers spread fast. Names were spoken. Connections made. People pieced it together faster than I expected. Someone said my wife's name. Someone said Derek's. Someone else said my daughter's name. And just like that, the story rewrote itself publicly. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad luck. This was betrayal, caught in the most undeniable way possible. I felt eyes on me then. Questions unspoken. People waiting for a reaction. I gave them none. I looked concerned, confused, hurt, all of which were true, just not in the way they thought. The responders loaded them carefully, professionally, and efficiently. There were no blankets thick enough to cover what had already been revealed. As the vehicles pulled away, the crowd stayed. People didn't know what to do with themselves. No one wanted to leave first, because leaving would mean acknowledging what they'd just witnessed. Neighbors approached me one by one. Soft words, sympathetic gestures, hands on my shoulder. "I'm so sorry," someone said. "I can't imagine," another added. I nodded. Thanked them. Said very little. The less you say in moments like that, the more people fill in for you. And they filled in everything. By the time the street finally cleared, the story had already spread beyond it. Messages buzzed on phones. Group chats lit up. What had happened would be discussed, dissected, and remembered long after the sirens faded. Inside the house, the silence was deafening. Furniture out of place. Doors damaged. Evidence of chaos everywhere. I stood there alone for a long time. Not triumphant. Not relieved. Just aware. Aware that nothing could ever go back to how it was. And that was the point. They believed secrecy protected them. They believed control was permanent. They believed no one would ever really see them. They were wrong. Truth doesn't need force. It needs exposure. And once exposed, it destroys everything built on denial. I locked the door behind me and left. Not because I was afraid to stay, but because there was nothing left to witness. The collapse was complete. Hospitals have a way of stripping drama out of everything. Bright lights, white walls, the steady rhythm of machines that don't care about what happened before you arrived. Whatever chaos brought you there, the building reduces it to procedures, charts, and clipped conversations. That's where the night ended. I arrived later than the ambulances, parking farther away than necessary. Not because I was hesitating, because I didn't want to rush anything. The waiting room was quiet, save for a television playing muted news and a low murmur of exhausted staff moving between stations. No one recognized me at first. That anonymity felt strange after the spectacle outside the house. There, everything had been loud, public, unavoidable. Here, everything was contained, controlled, sanitized. A nurse asked my name. I gave it. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Recognition. A pause before professionalism resumed. "They're being treated," she said carefully. "You can wait here." I nodded and sat down. Waiting does something to time. Minutes stretch. Thoughts loop. You replay scenes not because you want to, but because your mind insists on understanding what's already happened. I didn't repeat the chaos. I replayed the quiet moments before it. The mornings. The routines. The assumptions. I thought about how many times I'd walked into that same house believing I knew what waited for me. How easy it had been to trust silence. A few seats away, a man coughed. Somewhere down the hall, someone cried softly. Life continued in fragments, indifferent to personal catastrophe. Eventually, a doctor approached me. Calm, neutral, measured. He explained the situation clinically. No judgment, no commentary, just facts, treatment, observation, time frames. I listened. I thanked him. That was it. I didn't ask to see them immediately. That choice surprised me. Not because I didn't want answers, but because answers no longer mattered. Everything that needed to be revealed already had been. When I did see her, it was later. She looked smaller in the hospital bed. Pale, drained, not injured in a way that would scar, but changed in a way that couldn't be undone. She started crying the moment she saw me. Not quiet tears, not composed regret, raw sobbing. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I never wanted this." I sat in the chair beside the bed and waited for the crying to slow. I didn't interrupt. Apologies mean different things depending on when they're offered. Sometimes they're attempts to undo consequences. Sometimes they're acknowledgments that undoing is impossible. I asked one question. "How long?" She hesitated. I looked away, then answered. "Long enough." That was all I needed. She tried to explain after that. Loneliness, distance, feeling invisible, feeling wanted again. Words she'd probably rehearsed long before this night. I listened, not because I believed them, but because I wanted to hear how she framed her choices now that the illusion was gone. She spoke like someone shocked by exposure rather than regretful of intent. That told me everything. I stood when she finished. "I'm going to give you space," I said. She reached for my hand. I stepped back, not in anger, in finality. When I left her room, I didn't feel victorious. I felt closure. Derek's room was down the hall. I almost didn't go in. But curiosity isn't always a weakness. Sometimes it's confirmation. He looked worse. Not physically, emotionally. His confidence was gone, replaced by a tight, hollow stare and hands that couldn't quite stay still. He tried to speak when he saw me. I raised my hand. "Don't," I said. He stopped. That silence between us was heavier than any argument could have been. He knew, not just that he'd been caught, but that he'd miscalculated. Predators rely on invisibility. The moment they're seen, they unravel. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. When I returned to the waiting room, my phone buzzed. Messages, missed calls, notifications. The story had already traveled farther than the street it happened on. People wanted explanations. I didn't give any. Silence does the work for you when the truth is undeniable. By morning, exhaustion settled in. Not the kind that sleep fixes, but the kind that follows the end of vigilance. When you're no longer watching for the next sign, the next lie, the next move. I went home briefly to shower and change. The house felt different. Not empty, honest. The damage was still there. Broken door, displaced furniture. Evidence of what happens when secrecy collapses under pressure. I didn't rush to fix anything. Some things need to be seen before they're repaired. Back at the hospital later that day, things had shifted. The staff spoke more freely. Whispers in hallways had given way to knowing looks. The situation had become a story, not just an incident. Social consequences move faster than legal ones. They always have. By the second evening, the tone changed completely. Law enforcement arrived. Quietly, professionally. Questions were asked. Statements were taken. Details were documented. I answered what I was asked. Nothing more. Nothing less. The truth didn't need embellishment. It stood on its own. When I left that night, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the discovery. Stillness. Not peace. Not relief. Stillness. The kind that comes after a storm has passed and the air hasn't decided what it wants to do next. I didn't know exactly what would happen after that. Legally, socially, personally. But I knew one thing with certainty. The power dynamic had shifted completely. They weren't in control anymore. They weren't planning futures. They weren't choosing outcomes. They were reacting, explaining, defending. And I was finished reacting. That's the thing about exposure. It doesn't just reveal the truth. It rearranges who holds power afterward. And in that quiet hospital hallway, under fluorescent lights that revealed everything and hid nothing, I understood that the hardest part was over. What came next wouldn't be dramatic. It would be procedural, unforgiving, and final. Consequences don't arrive all at once. They arrive in waves. The first wave is shock. That's what everyone sees. The gasps, the whispers, the headlines people repeat to each other in disbelief. But shock fades quickly. What follows is something far more damaging. Accounting. That's when people start asking questions. Not emotional ones. Practical ones. The days after the hospital were filled with paperwork, phone calls, and meetings that stripped the situation of any remaining drama. When you remove emotion, all that's left is fact. Timelines. Records. Statements. Facts don't argue. They don't soften themselves. They don't care how someone feels about what they did. Law enforcement didn't treat it like a spectacle. They treated it like a process. Calm voices. Neutral expressions. Pens moving across paper. I answer questions. Not because I wanted revenge, but because silence no longer protected anyone. It only delayed the inevitable. My wife tried to control the narrative at first. She reached out through relatives, through friends, through carefully worded messages that never quite apologized for intent, only for outcome. I never meant for it to go this far. That sentence appeared more than once. When I left that night, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the discovery. I didn't respond. Intent matters more than outcome. And intent had already spoken. Derek's confidence didn't return. Men like him crumble quietly once the illusion breaks. They lose their posture. Their voices change. Their words shrink. The charm disappears. Because charm only works when people doubt themselves. Now no one did. The investigation widened. Patterns emerged. Not because I pushed them, but because patterns always emerge when lies unravel. Financial records, messages, timelines that suddenly made sense once examined without trust clouding judgment. People came forward, not loudly, carefully, each with a story that sounded disturbingly familiar. The same reassurances, the same gradual escalation, the same promises framed as certainty. Derek hadn't been building a future. He'd been harvesting options. That realization spread quickly through the community. Sympathy shifted. Support realigned. The narrative flipped without me saying a word. Neighbors stopped asking what happened and started asking how long it had been happening. That's the moment reputations die. Not when something shocking is revealed, but when people realize it wasn't isolated. My wife moved out. Not dramatically. Quietly. A suitcase. A few boxes. Silence thick with things left unsaid. She didn't ask me to stop the process. She didn't threaten. She didn't bargain. She knew bargaining required leverage, and she had none. Legal proceedings moved slowly, methodically, the way systems do when they're designed to outlast emotion. There were hearings, consultations, forms that asked blunt questions with no room for interpretation. Every signature felt final. Every document made something irreversible. Friends chose sides, not out of loyalty, but out of clarity. Some reached out to me with apologies for not noticing sooner. Others didn't reach out at all. Absence can be its own admission. Derek lost access to everything he once moved through freely. Homes, circles, trust. His name stopped opening doors and started closing them. That's how predators are dismantled. Not by force, but by exposure. They rely on access. Take that away, and there's nothing left. I watched all of this from a distance. Not because I was detached, but because involvement wasn't necessary anymore. The truth was doing the work. The most revealing moment came weeks later. A conversation I wasn't meant to hear, but did. Someone asked my wife if she regretted it. She said she regretted how it ended. Not that it happened. That told me everything. Regret without responsibility isn't remorse. It's an inconvenience. An inconvenience doesn't deserve forgiveness. The legal outcomes were decisive. Not dramatic. Not vengeful. Just final. Agreements signed. Protections enforced. Consequences assigned. No speeches. No courtroom theatrics. Just closure. People often imagine justice as something loud. It isn't. Justice is quiet. It's paperwork processed. Doors closed. Opportunities denied. Futures redirected. The neighborhood returned to normal faster than I expected. Life always does. Scandals fade into stories people tell cautiously, lowering their voices, shaking their heads. But the effects don't fade for the people involved. They live on in routines, altered permanently. My routines changed too. Not because I was broken, but because the life I'd been maintaining no longer existed. I sold things, gave away others, redefined spaces. There's something liberating about starting over when you didn't ask to, but choose to anyway. I wasn't angry. Anger had served its purpose and burned itself out. What remained was clarity. I understood something then that I hadn't before. People don't fear consequences. They fear exposure. Because consequences can sometimes be avoided. Exposure can't. Once people see who you are, they never unsee it. And that's the most permanent punishment of all. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel satisfaction the way movies tell you should. What I felt was alignment. The outside world finally matched what I knew to be true. And that alignment brought peace. Not happiness. Peace. The reckoning wasn't loud. It didn't end with slammed doors or shouted words. It ended with paperwork filed, paths separated, and silence settling where lies used to live. And in that silence, I realized something important. I hadn't lost my life. I'd recovered it. Life doesn't restart with a dramatic cut. It resumes. That's the part no one prepares you for. After everything settles, after the conversations end, the paperwork is signed, the explanations run out, what you're left with isn't emptiness. It's space. And space can be terrifying if you don't know what to do with it. The first few weeks were quiet. Not lonely, quiet in the way a house feels after guests leave. You notice things you ignored before. Sounds. Light. The way air moves through rooms when nothing is being hidden anymore. I slept better than I had in months. That surprised me. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because the tension was gone. The vigilance. The constant, low-level awareness that something wasn't right. Once the truth was exposed, there was nothing left to watch for. No more guessing. No more second-guessing myself. Just reality. And reality, even when painful, is easier to live with than doubt. I started changing the house slowly. Not as an act of erasure, but as acknowledgement. Some things were packed away. Others donated. A few thrown out without ceremony. Objects hold meaning longer than people do. Letting them go felt necessary. Neighbors treated me differently at first. Softer, more cautious. Some avoided eye contact, unsure of what to say. Others went out of their way to check in, offering help I didn't need, but appreciated. I accepted kindness when it was sincere. I declined pity. There's a difference. The hardest moments came unexpectedly. Not during obvious milestones, but during ordinary routines. Reaching for a second cup in the morning. Turning toward an empty space in conversation. Catching myself about sharing something out of habit. Those moments stung, but they passed. Pain loses its edge when you stop feeding it with questions that have no answers. I didn't rush into anything new. No dramatic reinvention. No sudden declarations about fresh starts or second chances. I'll let time do what it does best. Normalize. People often ask if I miss her. That's a complicated question. I miss the version of my life I believed in. I miss certainty. I miss the idea of permanence. But I don't miss the reality that replaced it. Once trust breaks at that level, it doesn't fracture, it dissolves. There's nothing left to repair. I thought a lot about forgiveness. Not in the way people expect, but in the way it actually functions. Forgiveness isn't reconciliation. It's released. And release doesn't require contact, conversation, or closure from the other person. It only requires a decision. I decided not to carry resentment forward. Not because she deserved relief, but because I deserved peace. That decision wasn't dramatic either. It happened quietly, over time, as anger lost relevance and clarity took its place. I learned something important through all of this. Betrayal doesn't destroy you. Confusion does. Once confusion is removed, strength returns naturally. I also learned to trust my instincts again. Not blindly, but respectfully. That quiet voice you ignore when everything looks fine. That's not paranoia. That's perception. It doesn't shout. It waits. I don't regret staying silent when I did. Silence gave me information confrontation never could. It revealed who people were when they thought no one was watching. And people reveal their truest selves in comfort, not conflict. My relationship with my daughter changed too. At first, there was pain, disbelief, grief for a future she thought she had. But over time, something else emerged. Honesty. The kind that only appears when illusions collapse. We spoke more openly than we ever had before. About trust. About boundaries. About how easily people confuse familiarity with safety. We became closer, not because of what happened, but because we chose to face it without pretending it meant nothing. That choice mattered. I don't tell this story for sympathy. And I don't tell it for revenge. I tell it because stories like this don't usually get told all the way through. They stop at the shock. They stop at the fallout. They stop where outrage ends. But life doesn't stop there. It keeps going. And what you do after betrayal matters more than what you do during it. You can become bitter. You can become numb. Or you can become precise. Precision is underrated. It means choosing who gets access to you. It means recognizing patterns early. It means understanding that loyalty without awareness is vulnerability. And vulnerability without boundaries invites harm. I didn't become cynical. I became selective. There's a difference. Trust isn't gone from my life. It's just earned now, not assumed. I notice more. I listen better. I ask questions sooner. And I don't ignore silence anymore. Silence speaks. Loudly. If there's one thing I want people to understand, it's this. You don't need to explode to reclaim your power. You don't need to destroy to survive. Sometimes the strongest move is stepping back and letting the truth walk forward on its own. Truth doesn't rush, but it never misses its destination. What happened to me didn't make me cruel. It made me clear. Clear about what I tolerate. Clear about what I value. Clear about what I will never ignore again. And that clarity has been worth everything. The house feels lighter now. Not because it's empty, but because it's honest. I wake up without tension. I go to sleep without questions. And in between, I live a life that belongs to me again. That's not revenge. That's recovery. And recovery is the quiet ending no one ever talks about, but everyone hopes for.